I love you, Sega Genesis. Does anybody else want to go home and hug their Genesis? It's just such a likable piece of equipment. Anyway, in Herzog Zwei, they give you 8 different levels, 8 different environments to fight in. Let's take a look at these, because each one of them is different, each one of them is exciting, each one of them requires different tactics and strategy if you're fighting the computer opponent or if you're fighting a human opponent. In part 2, we looked at a full game from start to finish against the computer. I don't have much multiplayer footage because my buddy and I, who used to play this all the time in high school, he's not in town anymore with me, so we can't do another all-nighter with some Herzog Zwei. But that is how this game turns out if you play against another human opponent who's good. It just goes on forever and ever and ever because you learn... Because unlike the computer, human opponents tend not to have an obsessive-compulsive disorder with capturing bases. People are definitely much harder to play against. Before the battle even got started, we'd have 50 units on the board, which is the maximum number of units that you can have on the board on your side. So with 100 different vehicles on screen, the Genesis was just screaming in pain with slowdown, crunching out the battle, but it still held it together. And I don't think, in all the years that we played this game and in the hundreds of games, I don't think I ever saw the Genesis crash once, which would have been devastating after an 8-hour game of Herzog Zwei, my Americanized translation of the title. The first board you saw was Vulcan, and no, Spock doesn't live there. He lives on the Starship Enterprise. The second board that you see is called Lock, and this is a neat one. This is sort of like a cave, and if you look at the map, when I pull up the map on the screen, you'll see that it's very maze-like. And the thing with each of these maps is that they make a tremendous difference if you play the game where you're using the equipment more to attack different bases. What you're seeing on screen is me attacking the enemy computer head-on most of the time because that's how I play against a computer. If you play against a human, you tend to rely on your machines more because a human opponent knows where you are and they're going to make sure that you're not coming anywhere near their bases or their units. So you definitely want to use a heavier defensive strategy against a human opponent. But a level like Lock requires you to launch your machines from certain places in the maze to make sure they don't get stuck running into walls or lost around corners and then they run out of energy. And, you know, they're all pretty stupid. They're like those droids that run around hospitals. So you have to learn the environment when you're playing with the units rather than just flying around destroying things yourself. This level is probably my least favorite, and I think the least inspired from a design standpoint. It's like a robotic factory level, but I think some of the other levels are more interesting. They have 2 levels and like lava running through them and stuff. This one's fairly wide open. It has a bunch of fences and barriers and factory kind of things that your units can get stuck behind. If you're playing against a person, you'll tend to use defensive lines more, where you'll take a whole bunch of cannons and stretch them from one side of the screen to the other so that when the enemy tanks run into them, they all get blown away. And the defensive cannons are the most powerful weapon in the game, and you can see those on screen because they look like little Star Wars gun turrets that have two barrels sticking out the front of them, and they're really effective because not only are they very powerful against enemy ground units, but they also launch missiles. And remember from part 2, missiles are the things that you want to fire at your opponent, at your opponent's transforming robot, because they're very destructive against that main transformer, or Jetfire, your Veritech fighter, whatever you want to call it. Anybody else ever notice that Jetfire from the Transformers looked identical to a Veritech fighter from Robotech? I'm actually not sure why that is. Did they just copy a Veritech fighter, or did they buy the rights to use a Veritech fighter and rename it Jetfire? And here we have Strand. I like this level. This one's pretty neat because it's mostly water. So if you're playing a longer strategic game, you can't use your defensive gun turrets as effectively. You also can't launch tanks from one side of the board to the other because there's water. So you have to use boats. One of the things that may not be very apparent is that you can launch your units from anywhere on the board you can give them commands to attack the home base, or to just attack an enemy on site, or to circle around, or to find an enemy sub-base. You can launch them from wherever you want, and they'll go off and follow your commands. But if they're going to be going a long distance, not only do they move very slowly and take forever to get there, they frequently get stuck, or they run out of energy, or your opponent sees them and destroys them. And that's one of the brilliant things about Herzog Zwei. It's how do you play the game? Do you launch attacks from one side of the board to the other? Because I believe that you really want to keep your enemy on their toes the entire time. So you want to have that attack on their home base periodically to disrupt them. So occasionally, yeah, you'll just fly back to your main base, launch a motorcycle, and then just let it go, and then like 10 minutes later it shows up at the enemy base and starts attacking it and confuses the hell out of the enemy or your friend that you're playing against. If you really want something to get there quickly, to get there on target, to make sure you know where it is and what it's doing, you actually deliver it in person. Here's a look at a game being played on the hard level, and there's not much difference, like I said, except that the game starts you off at a much stronger disadvantage. This level is Abgrund, which I like this level a lot because it's two levels, 2 layers, and it has a river running right through it. So if you launch an attack from one side of the board to the other, it's not going to go anywhere, because not only are they going to get stuck going from like the top of the hills down to the bottom of the ravine, but they're going to get stuck on that river. And what I'm doing here, and this game took me a while and was a lot of fun, is I'm occupying the computer by attacking one base and surrounding it with a bunch of missile launchers. And then while he's busy fighting that and getting destroyed half the time, I'm then starting to occupy other bases and work my way up to his main base. And then I eventually did destroy him. I made him cry. I broke the computer's will. Again. With the amount of times that I've crushed the Sega Genesis in this game, you would think that it hated me. But I'm fairly confident my Megadrive likes me. Here's a look at a 2-player game. This is actually just footage from the game replay, you know, when you sit there on the menu screen. But it gives you a nice example of how you actually would play the game. 2-player game's very different in that you can see at all times what your opponent is doing. So if you're playing your buddy who's sitting right next to you, you can see where he is on the board, and obviously that changes the game completely. You can see what units he's buying. I'm not sure what the status of Technosoft is these days. I assume they still hold the license to Herzog Zwei. This game is perfect to be remade for Xbox Live Arcade or the PlayStation Network or any kind of online gaming console in the future. I mean, it's just a perfect multiplayer game. It is so much fun, and the inclusion of this transforming robot while you're still controlling the real-time strategy of this army of units and tanks and missile launchers, it's incredibly fun and addictive. I'm confident that this game would be loved by millions of people and get a much better reception now than Herzog Zwei originally did back in 1990. So Technosoft, please remake this game for Xbox Live or PlayStation or Wii or something. Or maybe Sega is listening to this. Sega. You could also manufacture something like the Sega Genesis Live Network, so that those of us who still love our Sega Genesis, actually Megadrive sounds better in plural. For those of us who love our Megadrives and Sega Genesises, can you please give us something to hook them up online and play each other, like Sega Genesis Live? Come on. And you could bring out a version of Guitar Hero where you can play all the songs from Musha and Thunder Force 3 and Lightning Force. 16-bit synthesizer hero. How many different heroes can we make? We got accordion hero, Casio keyboard hero, and 16-bit synthesized music hero. Now is the time, Sega. Make it happen.